Okay, so as I just said, my name is Ruth Copson. I am a postgraduate researcher at UEA in Norwich, and I'm also a social worker. Primarily, my experience has been in adoption, but I've worked with foster carers as well, obviously through that. And I've been working on this very rapid research project with Beth Neal and Penny Sorensen, which was funded by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, when they were very keen to find out actually what is happening for everyone involved in contact and how virtual contact was working for everyone. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that and some of the findings and just share some thoughts on contact in general, really. So if I can have the next slide, please. So if we just have a think about what contact is and how it kind of works for everyone, one of the things about contact is the terminology, and it's often now called family time. So there's kind of debate and discussion about what we should be calling it. For this presentation, I'm just going to call it contact just because it's easier, but I acknowledge that actually for some people there's different terminology that works better. But contact is really about helping children feel part of their foster family and their birth family, and that integration of both families and promoting those relationships. And of course, every family is different, and really this is what the research has shown, is that every individual child is different, every foster family is different, every birth family is different. So the decision making really needs to be on a case-by-case basis. But really it works when relationships work. And we've seen some really lovely examples of foster carers and birth parents having some really nice contact with each other. But we've also seen that actually support must be available. So that needs an assessment as to who needs that support, and it really must be provided, which sometimes is and sometimes it isn't. So if I have the next slide, please. So the research questions that we were looking at were, how is birth family contact for children in care and kinship care and adopted children being facilitated? I'm going to concentrate on the children in foster care, but it does apply to other children as well. So we've got that one research question. We were also wanting to find out what experience people were having of using digital media to facilitate contact and how well that was working for everyone involved. So we did this project over, we were collecting data over a 4-week period. It was all completed within 6 weeks, so very, very quickly, because we really just needed to find out what was happening. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Oh, sorry, one before. I think I missed out on one. That's it. So we completed telephone interviews with 23 people, and that included 2 foster carers, 16 social workers. You can see who was involved with that. There were a lot of supervising social workers as well that we spoke to, and a lot of contact supervisors. So it was really helpful to get an overall picture. And initially we were just planning to do telephone interviews. We realised that actually we needed to speak to more people, and the way to do that was to do an online survey. So there may be some of you present who contributed to that, so thank you if you did. And again, you can see that actually the we did speak to a lot of carers through that survey as well. The 14 other carers that are mentioned primarily are all foster carers too, but they may have also adopted children, and they've kind of put themselves into the other category. Next slide, please. So what we found, and as this one person said, is that face-to-face contact has been cancelled until further notice, and it pretty much happened overnight. So people had to adapt extremely quickly, and we found that video calls were being put in place instead of face-to-face contact. Sometimes they were supervised by a professional on a Zoom call, for example. At other times, and quite frequently, it was down to the foster carer to supervise that contact. Or even if there was a professional there, obviously the foster carer was still having a significant involvement by helping the child to engage in that contact and that call. Sometimes they were just conversations, sometimes they were play-based activities, and we saw some really creative methods that were used, which I'll talk about in a bit. Sometimes the contact plans were kept the same as what they were before. So if there was once a week on a Friday contact, it would stay the same. But for others, it was actually more flexible, or easier to be flexible, and it may be better to have 2 phone calls a week, 2 shorter phone calls a week instead of 1 longer one. We found that video calls weren't really used much in adoption. And actually, though the adopters that we did speak to were ones who were having face-to-face contact anyway, so more unusual really. So some children and carers were having phone calls and messaging. We found that teenagers in particular were quite often using their own phones anyway to keep in contact with birth family. Carers were sending photos and videos, particularly for babies, to kind of fill that gap of contact. But we did hear some concerns about confidentiality sharing numbers. And we found very rarely there was face-to-face arrangement still happening. One example was of a teenager who was arranging to see his birth mum anyway, and it was felt actually was safer just to try and go for it and do it safely, do it at a 2-meter distance in the park. Another one was a child with significant needs, complex needs, and it was just felt for his emotional well-being, the contact just had to continue. So very rare that happened, but it did occasionally. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the experiences of the children, the carers and the parents very briefly, a very brief overview of what we found. So if you go to the next slide. What we were told was that virtual contact was providing a means of maintaining connections with birth family and peers and was a reasonable alternative under the circumstances, but we very much got the message that this wasn't a replacement for face-to-face contact. It shouldn't be a replacement for face-to-face contact for the majority of children. So for some it did work better, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the responses of children very much depended on the age of the child, their individual needs, whether that be their developmental needs, their behavioural needs, their previous experiences. So their previous experiences of face-to-face contact. We heard from one carer who was talking about a child who had very positive face-to-face contact with dad, and the carer also had a good relationship with dad, and that made virtual contact much easier, whereas with mum, contact beforehand was quite ad hoc. The child didn't find it very easy, and again, when it came to virtual contact, that was trickier as well. So those existing relationships are very important. And what I should say is that we didn't talk to children directly in this research. We just didn't have time, and it was obviously the circumstances were very difficult. So everything we were told about children came from the people around them, the social workers, the carers, and parents. So we found that in terms of the age of child, babies in particular were kind of raised as a critical issue, as we call it. So it was seen as having limited benefits. Virtual contact was seen as having limited benefits and was less effective for babies, and at times was confusing. So as one person said, the baby doesn't really understand why he can hear mummy but can't work out where she is. And we heard that time and time again from everyone. So people were trying very hard to maintain contact for babies, but actually was finding it very difficult. Teenagers, on the other hand, more familiar form of communication for them, and people were saying they're so used to doing it anyway, then that's just very natural to them. And they were also, teenagers and older children were finding it difficult to not have contact with their peers, so virtual contact was a way of keeping that going as well. Next slide, please. What we heard, again, particularly for younger children, but for every child, and I think, is that the lack of the sensory experience of face-to-face contact was really difficult, and that hearing a parent's voice face-to-face and being hugged and touched, and for one person it said they were talking about a young boy and said it left him feeling the loss of her hugs, referring to his mum. And we were, people were talking about that a lot during in the research. Children with disabilities, again, a little bit tricky for some, and for the majority probably, children with disabilities weren't able to engage in virtual contact. However, for others, we heard that actually it was surprisingly beneficial. So there was one young boy, I say young boy, he's probably a young teenager, who had complex needs, and his carers had a go at this virtual contact and actually found he loved it. And he was non-verbal, but he was grinning at the camera, and he was pulling faces and just really engaged in it. And everyone was really surprised and just, yeah, so that was a really positive thing that we heard, that it can work when maybe we didn't think it could. Carers in particular were talking about safe space for children. So we know that for many children, their foster home is their safe space, and some were finding it distressing to have birth parents entering that space through a video call. We heard that some children were worried that their parents were coming to, might find them. But for others, actually, the intensity that they were having in face-to-face contact was taken away, and that emotion was taken out of contact. And some really loved actually sharing that space with their birth family. So, for example, we heard about children who were really keen to share their bedroom at their foster carer and show their parents where they were sleeping. One young boy was really keen to show off his rugby skills in the garden, which he wouldn't been able to do in a contact centre, for example. And another child really liked being able to see her cat, who lived with birth mum, on a call, and again she wouldn't have that experience with face-to-face contact. So some some real benefits to that as well, but obviously it's very individual and depends on the circumstances. Another thing we heard was that there was more time for children to build relationships with carers and less disruption to routines. A lot of that was also around not having to go to school. So for the children who found school very difficult, being homeschooled for this period of time actually really helped them. And we kept hearing that actually creativity is key with these calls and these videos, because keeping children engaged in video calls is very difficult. Any child in particular, especially younger ones, and we had lots of lovely ideas around how people were doing that. So, for example, one mum was talking about how she bought a colouring book for her little boy, and she bought the same book and she posted it to him, and then on the call they were doing the same colouring together. Another was talking about how the carer was videoing a young toddler at play. So instead of having to put the toddler on her lap and trying to engage him in some kind of conversation, which wasn't going to work, she just kind of followed his play. One dad who played the guitar recorded him playing the guitar for the child, and other parents were recording nursery rhymes and bedtime stories and things like that. And there were games being played on calls. And also carers were very much involved in preparing children. So for children who struggle to know what to talk about on a call, they might provide a list of like topics or things to talk about, things to share. So that was, we found that to be really helpful for people. Okay, next slide, please. So if we think about the experience of carers, next slide, please. What we found, as Kit said, that actually there very much has been increased demands and responsibilities for carers. And whilst people are adapting, there have been real struggles. And a lot of that comes down to that additional responsibility with the supervision of contact. And whilst obviously carers have been generally focused on the well-being of the child, they were talking about some of the difficulties they were having, but also some of the real positives that have come out of the extra contact they've been having with parents. So we heard from some carers that they were very much being left to it, and they were told this contact has to happen, you need to do a call, and then there wasn't any supervision or support really. So that was obviously very tricky. Others were being very much supported by their supervising social worker and were really pleased about that. And also where there was a very clear plan of the contact and who was supervising it, if it was on a Zoom call with a supervisor there, then people felt that kind of guidance and those boundaries were helpful. Others found flexibility helpful. So again, very individual. And relationships with parents, I think, was the key issue. And this really gave an opportunity for carers and parents to have conversations with each other that they wouldn't have had before. So either because the child was transported to contact by a social worker or a family support worker, or because they just did a drop-off, a kind of quick handover at a contact centre. So this provided an opportunity for people to speak to each other, get to know each other a little bit, which worked well in some circumstances. And as this person said, this one carer, it's enabled us to have a little window into their lives, into the birth parents' lives and their environment and lifestyle, and given us and contact workers a chance to see how they are living and interacting with each other. So that was one real benefit to come out of that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, maintaining confidentiality was raised as a concern for some. Some were fine to share phone numbers and things like that. Again, it very much depends on the risk that birth parents pose, but and that's particularly when not supervised, so sometimes boundaries are a bit of an issue. And also some carers mentioned about when they're sending photos across, is their location being shared, for example. So people weren't always aware of what the software could do and what would happen to information that was shared. So again, that's where professionals come in and to support that and to really help people. And also we found that some carers needed help with internet access and getting on the right platforms and things like that. So having some guidance around that was very helpful. And we heard that some people actually really liked having more control over the contact, or some who wanted more were frustrated by professionals preventing it. And one example of that was an adoptive parent whose child had siblings who were in foster care, and the parent really wanted to be able to directly contact the foster carer to arrange this contact and calls between themselves, but they were stopped by the social worker and said that isn't allowed. So sometimes, you know, there are situations when that can happen and there wouldn't be anything wrong with that at all. So just thinking kind of outside the box sometimes would be helpful. And we heard that carers were very much managing children's reactions to the contact, which could be positive. And we heard that a lot of children, some children, found virtual contact easier, and behaviours that they'd seen with face-to-face contact had stopped. So, for example, bedwetting, that had then stopped when it changed to virtual contact. Others were having to manage the distress of children not being able to see their parents, and how they were finding that very difficult. And carers were obviously managing this alongside every other pressure that they're having, so their own family commitments, birth children, home educating the children, work commitments, and also a lot of the carers were in the vulnerable group themselves, so they may have been over 70 or had health issues. So there were lots of things to consider and extra kind of worries and anxieties for people that were really coming through. Okay, next slide, please. And just briefly about, we talked to birth parents, we heard from quite a few birth parents, and I interviewed, I think it's 4 birth mothers during the research. We didn't actually hear from any birth fathers, so they were all mothers and one aunt who answered the survey as a birth family member. The next slide, please. And obviously, I think, you know, when parents can't see their children, that will cause anxiety and distress, and that's very much the message that came through, was that parents were reporting that they're scared, they can't sleep, they're constantly thinking of what if they get sick, worrying about how the children are, and being able to provide that reassurance to birth parents was helpful. But professionals in particular were saying that actually we found that parents are very understanding of what's happening. They understood that the situation was kind of bigger than us, bigger than social workers, and was a societal issue, and that it did keep everyone safe to not have face-to-face contact. But that didn't take away from the fact that they were angry and frustrated by what was happening, and they just very much missed their children and missed the physical touch. They missed being able to see them, and that was very distressing for them. And another key issue for birth parents was this idea of digital poverty. So a lot of birth parents didn't have access to Wi-Fi or didn't have a smartphone, and couldn't afford that. And so we found that social workers were often helping with that. So local authorities were providing equipment for parents to enable them to have contact. And also there was support provided for so parents with learning disabilities, for example, who may have struggled to access a video call. Then again, support was offered and help with ideas and things about having that contact. So next slide, please. So just to kind of summarise, I know I've kind of bombarded through that a little bit, but what we really need to think about in promoting positive links is keeping the child's needs at the centre of planning. And you know, what is that for some children, virtual contact has been working very well, and I think there needs to be a flexible approach, kind of moving on from solely virtual contact, and what works well and what doesn't. And obviously that needs to take into account the needs of birth family members, foster carers, adoptive parents and kinship family members. And those needs will be very different. So you could have one carer who is very much happy to facilitate contact and supervise it, whereas another actually it's too difficult and it just needs to go back. And some carers said to us, we just want to go back to face-to-face contact. We can't wait for it to go back to normal. So it very much depends. But the opportunities are there to build trust and collaboration, empathy, and you know, everyone's got this shared sense, we hope, of a goal between carers, adopters and birth relatives about doing something for the best interest of the children. And that is obviously difficult at times, but there are opportunities to build those relationships, and maybe we can work on that and have a think about how that can be done going forward. And risk needs to be managed proportionally. Trying to be kind of risk aware as opposed to risk averse. And I think what this has shown is that some things are happening with virtual contact that would probably we were told, no, you can't do that, or it's too risky, but actually it's been fine. So again, think about the risks of what's involved, and can we manage it and can we not? And obviously family contact time needs to be rewarding, fun and child friendly, and those creative methods that people have been using have been really helpful to think about how we can make that family friendly and child friendly, so everyone gets the most out of contact. And if we just go on to the next slide, the final slide, just provides you with some links to the reports that we've been doing. So we've got a full report, we have got the briefing paper there, we don't want quite a full read. And also the research project was part of a slightly wider project within the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and there was also an evidence review on digital contact with the link there too.